Good morning. I'm Jim Reardon Anderson. I'm the interim dean of the School of Foreign Service, and one of my chief pleasures in this job is being able to work with some of our outstanding centers, including the Center for Russian, Eurasian, and Eastern European Studies, headed by Angela Stent. Thanks to Angela and her staff, we put together this session this morning to talk about Ukraine, the crisis in Ukraine, and the way forward. And we're very grateful for the support of the Chevron Corporation for helping to sponsor this event. But most of all, we're thankful for all of you for joining us and helping to engage not only as an audience, but we hope as participants in the discussion of this important topic. I'm personally just a poor China scholar and am not acutely knowledgeable of these matters, but I will tell you that President Obama, who you know is now in Beijing, is acutely interested in the secondary impacts of the Ukrainian crisis, which is now having spillover effects in Sino-Russian relations and therefore indirectly important considerations for U.S. foreign policy. So I will be an avid listener to this discussion this morning and appreciate your attendance, and especially want to thank Angela and her staff for putting on this important event. So Angela.
Thanks, Jim. And Steve, you want to come up here? So thank you very much, Jim, and let me add my welcome to everyone here. Thank you for coming to discuss this quite important topic today. The Ukraine crisis erupted a year ago. And what we now have had in that year is at least two very different narratives about what happened and who's responsible and how to go forward. There's no agreement on basic facts between different parts of these narratives. So we have fundamental disagreements there between Russia, the European countries, the United States, and other countries. But we're very fortunate today that we have some of the best experts on these subjects to help us understand what the facts are, what happened, and maybe, if possible, how one might find a better way forward of dealing with this crisis. So that's what we're here today to discuss. And of course, first of all, we need to understand the historical background to this. And we are delighted to have Professor Stephen Kotkin from Princeton University here. He is a prolific author of many books, as I'm sure most of you know. He's the Berkland Professor of History and International Affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School and at the History Department at Princeton University. His latest book, which has just come out, is Stalin, Volume 1, so I'm sure there are a couple more volumes to come, Paradoxes of Power. And other books that he has published are Uncivil Society, 1989, and the Implosion of the Communist Establishment. And then, of course, a book that I know my students read, Armageddon Averted, The Soviet Collapse, 1970 to 2000. And he's currently directing Princeton's Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies program. So please join me in welcoming Professor Stephen Kotkin.
It's probably better to stand if that's okay with you. Normally, someone asks everyone to turn their cell phones off.
Oh, yes.
But I will instead ask you to take them out and begin to order so that your order shall be complete before I'm finished. We don't want to miss anybody. So don't turn your cell phones off quite yet. Okay. So thank you, Angela, for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here. The history of relations between Ukraine and Russia is a demanding and difficult, complex topic. You're not going to get a comprehensive presentation on this question right now. That would take up too much time. Instead, I'm going to make an argument, and I'm going to try to illustrate that argument about the way that Stalin created today's Ukraine and how Putin is constrained by what Stalin did. So this argument about Stalin creating Ukraine and Putin being constrained by it will then be primarily, obviously, a 20th century, post-1917 discussion of the relations between the two countries. But certainly if we have a question and answer period afterwards, as I expect, we can go to the pre-1917 period as well. Okay, so how could it have been that Stalin created today's Ukraine? Now, there was a Ukraine before Stalin. There's no question. Between 1917 and 1921, a Ukrainian state emerged from the Great War, the revolutions, the German occupation, the Polish-Soviet War, and then Sovietization. This was a very confused, tangled mess of a process. The German government, for example, signed a treaty with the Ukrainian government at Brest-Litovsk in early 1918, but that Ukrainian government was not in power that the Germans signed the treaty with. Kiev changed hands 19 times during the Civil War between 1918 and 1920. Trotsky allied the Red Army with the anarchists in Ukraine fighting the White Army, and then when the whites were defeated, Trotsky went after the anarchists with the same venom that he had gone after the White Army. So it's a very tangled mess, this emergence of the Ukrainian state. But nonetheless, in 1921, there was a Ukrainian state on the map that had previously, before 1917, not existed in the Tsarist Empire as a state entity. It's very important. We can argue about the depth of Ukrainian national feeling. There are differences in the scholarly literature about how strong the national feeling was in this new Ukrainian state. It had emerged, as I said, under German occupation, partially as a result of a war between the Soviet Union, Soviet Russia, and Poland, right? So some people debate whether this Ukrainian state was supported by strong national feeling or not, or whether it was an artifact of war and revolution. We're not taking a position on that right now. The importance of the state's existence on the map is what we're discussing. Now, this Ukrainian state, right, was not popular with much of the Bolshevik Party. Much of the Bolshevik Party refused to acknowledge the power of nationalism. After all, it was proletarians of the world unite, and nation was seen as either a bourgeois phenomenon or as a temporary phenomenon. So there was quite a strong faction in the Bolshevik Party that wanted to put the genie back in the bottle and get rid of these World War I era national states that had arisen on the former Tsarist Empire. Stalin, however, was a strong proponent for the recognition of nationalism. There was a famous 10th Party Congress in March 1921. You will note it as the Party Congress where Lenin outlawed factions within the party. It's a very well-known party conference. Stalin also gave a speech at this party conference, and his speech was about the need to recognize nation. Quote, "Clearly, the Ukrainian nation exists, and the development of its culture is a duty of communists. One cannot go against history." That's Joseph Stalin. Clearly, the Ukrainian nation exists, arguing in March 1921 at the 10th Party Congress. Not necessarily a quote that Putin may use today. One cannot go against history, unquote. Now, Stalin's idea was tactical. Nation was important because you could win the allegiance of the people. You could win them to the communist cause on the basis of a national appeal, and you needed the nation as a vehicle to modernize the country, because these nations of Eurasia were predominantly peasant nations, but using nationalism, you could win their allegiance and you could set them on a path of urbanization and industrialization. So it's a tactical recognition of how communism could use nation, but it's also a realistic understanding that nation is not going away, which is something that not every communist at the top understood, but Stalin did. Now, point number two. So now we have Stalin recognizing the existence of the Ukrainian nation early on. Point number two. Stalin, of course, had no intention of letting this Ukrainian nation go its own way. In fact, it was Stalin who brought Ukraine back into relationship with Russia. This is a much misunderstood process. We're going to go through it a little bit. The Ukrainian state that emerged as a result of this 1917, 1918 to 1920, 21 tangled mess of war, revolution, civil war, and occupation was an independent country. It signed a treaty with Soviet Russia. That is, even after the Red Army reconquered Ukraine, Ukraine existed as a de facto independent state, Soviet Ukraine. It signed a state-to-state treaty with Soviet Russia. Lenin himself signed the treaty. Ukraine had diplomatic relations and signed treaties with other independent countries after its reconquest by the Red Army. Soviet Ukraine had a diplomatic representative in Moscow. It was not a simple task to bring this newly created Soviet Ukraine back into a relationship with Russia. Stalin was the one who mostly oversaw this process. Now, Stalin further said at the 10th Party Congress, the same 10th Party Congress in March 1921, where he told them that the Ukrainian nation exists and you can't go against history, he also said, quote, "Not one Soviet republic taken separately can consider itself safe from economic exhaustion and military defeat by world imperialism." Translation, we need to integrate back into a single unit in order to be strong enough to survive in the international system. So concretely, Stalin proposed in 1922 that Soviet Russia, which was known as the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, RSFSR, Soviet Russia, would absorb the other Soviet republics. They would retain their national territorial unit inside the RSFSR, and they would have considerable domestic autonomy inside once they're absorbed into the RSFSR. Meaning, the RSFSR was already a federation. It had Tatarstan, it had Yakutia, it had other ethnic units inside of it, and it would absorb the Soviet republics that had been formed as a result of war, revolution, and occupation into a larger RSFSR, or Federated Soviet Russia. Trotsky supported this plan, and Lenin supported this plan. However, Lenin then changed his mind. After initially supporting the absorption idea with autonomy, Lenin changed his mind and said instead he would like to see a larger federation that Russia itself would join. This was the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Meaning that it wasn't that Ukraine would be absorbed into Russia and retain autonomy. It was that Ukraine and Russia as equal units would join a new unit, the USSR, a larger federation. Stalin disagreed with Lenin vehemently on this point. It was a tactical disagreement. Neither one of them wanted to let the other units go away. They wanted an integrated state, but the specific mechanisms of the integrated state, there were tactical differences. Lenin's view was that as revolutions happened around the world, new Soviet republics would join the USSR. If there was a revolution in Hungary, Soviet Hungary would become part of the USSR. If there was a revolution in Germany, Soviet Germany would become part of the USSR. Stalin thought this was pie in the sky, and we have a letter exchange with Lenin on this question. Basically, he told Lenin that he was out of his mind, that Ukraine, fine, but Hungary, Germany would join a single state with Russia. He said the most you could hope for would be confederation, a loose relationship, rather than integration into a single state. But Lenin was insistent. So Lenin bet on the USSR, which was a bet on world revolution. Stalin wanted the RSFSR, Soviet Russia, to be the mothership. It was a bet on historic Russia. It didn't preclude world revolution, but it was a bet on historic Russia. Now think about this. The USSR dissolved into its constituent republics in 1991. The RSFSR, the old Soviet Russia, is still there. Had Stalin gotten his way, when communism fell in 1991, potentially, we would still have a single state there, the RSFSR. So the tactical differences between Lenin and Stalin were enormous in 1922. They had enormous long-term consequences. This is why many people blame Lenin and support Stalin's view retrospectively in this idea of how to form a state with the Soviet republics that emerged out of war, revolution, and occupation. Now, Stalin could have tried to put the genie back in the bottle, meaning get rid of the ethnic or national territorial units completely. Many were advocating that. That was known as Luxembourgism, because Rosa Luxemburg was the principal proponent of this. He could have pushed his own position, which was absorption into Russia. This would require him going against Lenin and going against the national communists in Ukraine, who didn't want absorption into Russia, but were agreed to a USSR federal relationship. And Stalin had a principled point. He said, why should Ukraine be on the same equal status as Russia or Belarus entering the Union, but the Tatar Republic is not entering the Union as a constituent republic? Lenin said it's more equal if Ukraine and Russia join something together, and Stalin said that's not equal, because all the members of the RSFSR, Soviet Russia, would not be entering the Union on an equal basis with Belarus and Ukraine. Why was Ukraine a higher level status than Tatarstan? So Stalin was arguing at principle also. This is lost in the literature for the most part. Okay, so we have Stalin arguing that Ukrainian nation exists, and with Lenin wanting an integrated state, bringing Soviet Ukraine back into relationship with Russia, and doing it Lenin's way, faithfully, as Lenin's disciple, rather than his own way, with the long-term consequences of the Soviet dissolution into Lenin's plan of the Union republics rather than the mothership of the RSFSR. All right, now let's get to the borders, point 3. The borders and nationalization. So Soviet Ukraine had no natural border in the east. There was no natural border in the east of Soviet Ukraine with Soviet Russia. The Ukrainian nationalists, going back to the Tsarist period, developed their own maps of where the border in the east should be. Russians developed their map of where the border in the east should be, and the borders obviously didn't coincide. So the actual border that was agreed in the Union Treaty pleased no one. The eastern border of Soviet Ukraine pleased no one. There were very minor adjustments to the eastern border of Soviet Ukraine in 1925 and 1928. Very minor adjustments. There were difficult problems. For example, there's no Jewish autonomous oblast on the territory of Ukraine, even though very large population of Jews lived on the territory of Ukraine. And the reason there is no Jewish autonomous province in Ukraine or republic is because the Ukrainians blocked it. Stalin didn't block it. The Ukrainians refused to allow a Jewish enclave either at the level of a province or an autonomous republic on their territory. But nonetheless, the eastern border pleased no one. The western border, as you know, has a different history. It comes from the pact with Hitler and World War II. As a result of the pact with Hitler, Stalin annexed eastern Poland, which became western Ukraine and western Belarus. The city of Lvov, which the Germans know as Lemberg, and the Soviets knew as Lvov, and the Ukrainians know as Lviv, was a predominantly Polish-speaking and Yiddish-speaking city when it was annexed by the USSR. There was a Ukrainian countryside in former Eastern Poland, what became Western Ukraine, but the cities were not Ukrainian-dominated. They became Ukrainian-speaking cities only under Stalin and his successors. Now, most of the actions of the Hitler-Stalin Pact are considered illegitimate or invalid in historical terms. But you don't hear the Ukrainians saying that the Hitler-Stalin Pact was wrong and we should give Western Ukraine back to Eastern Poland from which Stalin stole it. But this area, Western Ukraine, is seen as the core of West Ukrainian nationalism. But West Ukrainian nationalism is a predominantly Stalin-era product because until Stalin, Western Ukraine was in Poland. And until Stalin, the cities of Western Ukraine were predominantly Polish-speaking and Yiddish-speaking. You weren't going to get a West Ukrainian, a Ukrainian language university education here until Stalin. Okay, so there are a few other border changes. Transcarpathia. Transcarpathia is also a piece that Stalin will bite off in the late 40s and annex that southwestern part of Ukraine to Ukraine. And of course, there's a final territorial shift under Khrushchev in 1954, the 300th anniversary of the treaty, which some people interpret as a defense treaty and others interpret as an incorporation of the steppes into Tsarist Russia. The 300th anniversary of that treaty in 1954, Khrushchev gave unilaterally Crimea from the Russian Republic, RSFSR, to Soviet Ukraine. Okay. But except for Khrushchev's action over Crimea, Ukraine is a Stalin creation and bequeathal, national Ukraine especially. Stalin executed countless officials of Ukrainian ethnicity. Not only Ukrainian, obviously. He executed countless officials of Ukrainian ethnicity, countless intellectuals of Ukrainian ethnicity. But he promoted still more to take their place. The vast majority of officials who will come down into the late Soviet and early Ukrainian independent era, those officials are Stalin-era promotees. And many of them, a lot of them, are Ukrainian ethnic. Now, this is not a statement about Stalin being good, Stalin being a Ukrainian nationalist, Stalin not being a murderous tyrant. Stalin is a murderous tyrant. At the same time, he is promoting, both with territorial border expansion and with internal nationalization, he is promoting a national Ukraine. Not because he wants it to leave the Soviet Union, obviously, he has no intention of that. But nonetheless, even when Russian language is belatedly introduced as a requirement in Soviet schools, which is very late in the game, it doesn't trump the vernacular languages. Stalin insists in the decree that the vernacular languages will be on the same level and also taught. It's very important. All right, I'm almost done. Now, there are many other things I could have talked about today that I didn't talk about, but that could be fair game in the Q&A. Ukraine was a key part of the Soviet military-industrial complex. Ukraine, depending how you measure it, Soviet GDP is very hard to measure, but Ukraine is approximately 15% of Soviet GDP. It's at least 30% of the Soviet military-industrial complex. Many of those factories still exist today. Leonid Kuchma, for example, is a pure product of the Soviet military-industrial complex, and much of your Ukrainian nomenclatura in the Soviet period and in the early independence period are descendants of this military-industrial complex. We didn't talk about that today. Another thing we could have talked about was the role that Ukraine played in the Soviet collapse. Very late in the game, but nonetheless decisively, Ukraine refused to remain a member of any unit that would succeed the USSR, other than the fake Commonwealth that was organized, improvised in the Belarusian hunting lodge, the old Tsarist hunting lodge in the forest in Belarus, right? Ukraine's decision not to remain in relationship with Russia meant that there would be only independent states effectively that would succeed the Soviet Union, rather than some new reformed union, smaller, but nonetheless in federation. Ukrainian leadership late in the game, but decisively refused that. We're not talking about that today. We could have talked about how Boris Yeltsin threatened in late 1991 to take Crimea back from Ukraine. This is not a well-known episode, but he issued that threat. Like much of what Yeltsin said in public, it was an empty threat. But nonetheless, it indicates the extent to which the Russians felt uncomfortable with the emerging post-Soviet settlement, even before the post-Soviet settlement was codified. However, our key takeaway for today, what I've concentrated on, is the fact that Stalin created a national Ukraine. In his murderous, bloody, tyrannical fashion, but nonetheless he created a national Ukraine. It didn't exist before Stalin in the form that it comes down to us now, neither in terms of the territory nor in terms of the Ukrainian language spoken in the cities. So Putin is facing this national Ukraine, this sovereign national Ukraine, and he denies its existence, as if Stalin didn't do the work that Stalin did. But that Ukraine exists. As Stalin said, one cannot go against history. There is a Ukrainian nation, even more so now than before. And so Putin has rendered this Stalin inheritance even more ethnically Ukrainian than it was before. As you know, Yanukovych won the presidential election by about, 2 million votes? 1 million of those votes came from Crimea, approximately. Right? The enclaves in eastern Ukraine right now have also rendered rump Ukraine, the rest of Ukraine, more ethnically Ukrainian than it was before. So Putin is consolidating further the Ukrainian nation that he inherited from Stalin, even though he doesn't intend to do that. In fact, Ukraine just elected for the first time in its history a pro-European parliamentary majority, which was impossible previously given the Crimean and Eastern Ukrainian votes that were absent from this recent voting, in part because of Putin's support for the separatists and his forceful seizure of Crimea. So Putin likes to cite, he cited on occasion, Catherine the Great, her conquests, so-called New Russia, Novaya Rossiya, but he can't wipe out the fruits of the Lenin-Stalin machinations. Unlike Stalin, indeed because of Stalin, but also because of Putin's own regime's behavior, Putin cannot entice Ukraine into a union with Russia. He is instead, in a way, even though it doesn't look like it, trapped by the Stalin inheritance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for questions and answers. Do you want to stay standing or sit down, or?
You're in charge. You just give me
Okay,
the word.
maybe stand. So I'm going to ask you the first question, talking about Stalin's creation of the Ukrainian national state. I haven't read your book yet, and it's probably, and you deal with this in volume 2, but where do you place the discussion around the Holodomor there and the impact of what happened in the 1930s on Stalin's view of the creation of Ukraine?
Right, so there is no question whatsoever, as I said many times, that Stalin is a murderous tyrant. There is no way to question that. Moreover, the murders that he commits are not functional murders. They're not related to real enemies. They're not related to improving Soviet security. They don't have a functional side. That argumentation is wrong. So let's take the specific case of the famine. So Holodomor, as the Ukrainians use that expression, is a famine extermination. It is an intentional famine and an intentional singling out of the Ukrainian people. That's what they mean by the term. There is no doubt that Stalin was a primary cause of the famine, but there is also no documentation whatsoever of any reliability to support that Stalin intentionally aimed a famine at the Ukrainian people. Unfortunately for the Ukrainian nationalists who push the Holodomor cause, they cannot cite any real internal documents that Stalin wrote or signed which indicate his intention to purposefully starve and or exterminate the Ukrainian people. We have not full documentation potentially. There could be other documents we haven't seen yet. But I've seen everything that is seeable. And I've seen Stalin's pencil marks on a lot of things. He was aware of the famine. He understood the grief, the horror that was going on. And late in the game, he reduced some of the pressure, in fact. So the one thing we have that's documented is Stalin, too late and too little, pulling back from the pressure of the famine and the starvation and reducing some of the grain quotas. But we don't have a single document indicating an intentional desire on his part to target Ukrainians, let alone to exterminate that nation. However, we will never be able to overturn the Holodomor story with the facts. The story is too big for the facts. It is about Ukrainian national identity. It's about being a victim rather than a perpetrator. The same way that lots of the East European historiography has no national communists in it. You can read about the history of communist Poland, and they won't mention that there were Polish, ethnic Polish communists. It's all an occupation. It's all an imposition. It's all Moscow, right? And so we have the same issue in Ukraine. And so the story is very congenial to the victimization narrative, and therefore the facts are powerless vis-a-vis a story that important, that congenial to the Ukrainian nationalists.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for questions. Do we have microphones? Yes. Okay. Questions? Okay. And if you can, identify yourself.
Hello, Professor Kotkin. It's very nice to hear your presentation. I'm Patrick Bell. I'm from Florida International University. And in particular, you may have covered some of this, but my question has to do specifically with Putin's revisionist interpretation of Novorossiya. And in particular, his using of that as I would say, as a straw man, if you will, for his actions in eastern Ukraine.
Yeah, so there's no question that there was a new Russia under Catherine the Great. This is not a Putin invention. He perhaps is twisting the story to suit his purposes. He is tendentiously discussing what the borders were of New Russia, what the ethnicities were inside New Russia. But the fact of New Russia is indisputable. My point is not to dispute the existence of New Russia under Catherine the Great. It's to say that he's leaving out the subsequent history. And the subsequent history is more germane, in many ways, to the facts on the ground today. But, you know, he's using history for his own purposes. So we can expect him to leave out the fact that this national Ukraine postdates the New Russia. And for him to try to focus on the New Russia and to form a New Russia in the public sphere, in contemporary Russia, to form a New Russia that suits his geopolitical aims. But having said that, I don't know what he's doing. I don't know what he's up to. I regard the imputation of motives and plans. I read a lot of analyses of what Putin is up to, and people are imputing motives to him. And I'm not sure where they get these motives from. The amount of information we have about decision-making processes inside that regime is very limited, close to non-existent. Right? There was if you read the WikiLeaks documents, for example, it's shocking how little access is revealed to inside government people in those WikiLeaks documents. The ambassador is talking to opposition figures. The ambassador is talking to investigative journalists. The ambassador is talking to think tank people. but the ambassador is not having significant conversations with internal members of the regime, and that's early. Later on, the access gets even worse. So I'm not sure we know what Putin is up to, and I'm not sure he knows what he's up to. But on the history story, he is tendentiously using the fact of New Russia under Catherine the Great for his purposes, while leaving out the history that I tried to present today.
Andreas Umland, Institute for Euro-Atlantic Cooperation in Kiev. I'm absolutely fascinated by your lecture, and I'm going to recommend it to my students and my colleagues in the video that has been taken. But I want to challenge you on one particular issue. You emphasized the sort of the role of Stalin as an, I guess, unintentional co-creator of the Ukrainian nation. How much would that be compared to Stalin's role in the creation of other post-Soviet or Soviet nations, like the Kazakhs? And how would you compare that to Stalin's role in the promotion of Russian nationalism? I see here a certain disbalance that I think Stalin also played a big role in the creation of the modern Russian nation, and I think much more intentionally so, much more purposefully so. If you take books like David Brandenburger's National Bolshevism or Gennady Kostyrchenko or the Russian Party by Nikolai Mitrokhin, I think there indeed Stalin plays, and the post-Stalinist leadership after Stalin's death plays indeed a role in actually creation the Russian nation and the Russian national. Whereas with the Ukrainian nation and maybe also with the other post-Soviet nation, that's a qualitatively, in my view, other story.
Okay, thank you for the question. So that's a complicated story, but I'll try to give a reasonably brief answer. So we have a lot of documentation of Stalin insisting that the nations are not withering away. That nation is a stronger factor than the other communists understand. We have this documentation early, and it continues late. Even when Stalin allows that Russia is a nation too, which, by the way, is true, and the idea that Russia is a nation is fully compatible with Soviet practice and with Soviet institutions. If Ukraine is a nation, why is Russia not a nation? So people like Brandenburger, who argue that there's something special about the Russian nation under Stalin, are exaggerating both the fact that the Russian nation is not a problem in the Soviet system and the limits that Stalin imposes on Russian nation in the Soviet system. Many times Stalin had the opportunity to trump the vernaculars and to force more Russian language, Russian culture, and Russian history on the whole Soviet people, and he refrained from doing so. This is a really important fact. It's very well documented and deeply documented. The impression that Stalin is a Russian nationalist is exaggerated, although it has a basis in reality. The big story, which we get, for example, from Peter Blitzstein, who's much better than Brandenburger on this question, are the limits that Stalin imposes on Russianness, even as he promotes it. The idea that Stalin promoted the Ukrainian nation by accident primarily is also falsified by the documentary record. He is promoting the Ukrainian nation. He's promoting every nation because it's a tool for him. It's both ineradicable in his mind, so therefore there's a realism, but it's also an effective tool for rule. He gets nation in a way that many other high Bolsheviks don't. So the way I would put it is, yes, there is a stronger promotion of the Russian nation later in the 1930s, but we don't want to see that out of the context of all the other things he's doing. And the promotion of the non-Russian nations is neither accidental, nor random, nor low level. It's very high level. Now, he's doing this not because he's looking to make them independent. And so he's constantly fighting against national phenomenon as he's promoting them at the same time. So this is where you get the contradictions. There's a famous letter to Kaganovich in 1926. Kaganovich is a Stalin minion, party boss in Ukraine, and having a fight with ethnic Ukrainian leaders in Ukraine over the nature of Ukrainianization. How deep what institutions, who's going to be promoted. And Stalin tries to take a middle ground, supporting Kaganovich, but reprimanding him at the same time. Supporting some of the claims of the Ukrainian nationalists who've been in his office prior to him writing the letter, but also trying to contain them. So this containment promotion problem, right, never goes away for him. And of course, he's going to apply the methods of terror in managing this problem, or trying to manage the problem. So this is going to make it look like he is suffocating the nationalism of Ukraine. But he's not. He's trying to contain it at the same time as he promoted, contain it within bounds of loyalty, or within the bounds that he understands are permissible in the Soviet system, which he, as the arbiter, can decide that, right? And so we need the complexity of this process. That's why my answer is not as simple, perhaps, as one would like, but the complexity of this process is well revealed in the documentation.
Other questions?
James Sher from Chatham House. I second Andreas's comment about the importance of the lecture that we've heard. Just first of all, one footnote. You mentioned Boris Yeltsin raising this issue of Crimea reverting to Russian sovereignty. But at the same time, in 1990, 1991, there were many suggestions, some very strong, from Kozyrev and from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that borders would have to be revised, particularly in Ukraine, as part of creating this process. And this developed such an intensity that the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry finally had to say, if you put these issues on the table, we will put issues on the table of historic Ukrainian lands in what is now southern Russia. Yes. My question is this. Would you, in the light of your comments about Stalin, comment on the assertion many associate with Putin, but which is far broader than Putin, that Ukrainians and Russians are the same people, that there is no distinct Ukrainian people? Now, some might connect this, and some have, back to Alexander II's view of Greater Russians as a tripartite people, incorporating Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Great Russians. But from what you are saying about Stalin, this does not seem to be his optic, that there is no Ukrainian nation, there is no Ukrainian people. But if you could comment on the origins of that proposition, I'd be grateful. Thanks.
Okay. Yes. So, starting from the back end of your question. So, of course, it was the view of many people in the Russian Empire that there was a single ethnicity, Russia, and that it broke down into three categories, so-called Great Russians, so-called Little Russians or Lesser Russians, you know, in the French understanding of Greater and Lesser, and Belarusians or White Russians, who originally are an artifact of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So this idea, strongly held under the Tsarist period, is inherited, obviously, by the post-1917 structures. It's very important, however, that we have the facts on the ground. The facts on the ground transform this conversation. So you can continue to argue that Ukraine is really just a branch of Russian ethnicity. It's really just the lesser Russian people, but still the Russian people. You can continue to argue that, but you have a problem. You have a Ukrainian state on the map. And this Ukrainian state on the map, when the Bolshevik regime is weak, it's not clear its allegiances are automatically going your way. It's been very, like I said, Kiev changes hands 19 times during the Civil War. And so the Bolshevik regime feels, especially with Stalin, the need for tactical reasons and out of weakness to accept this fact on the ground Ukrainian nation and to try to manage it and win loyalties on its behalf. But Stalin goes deeper than this. It's not solely a tactical question for him. He recognizes that nationalism is powerful, in part because of Georgian nationalism. Georgian nationalism is something that Lenin has no idea about, right? He never set foot in the Caucasus. Lenin doesn't know anything about Ukraine either, right? Lenin knows a lot about a few places, Simbirsk, right? He knows a lot about Zurich, right? The Dada Cafe was down the block from him, right? But he knows nothing about Imperial. Stalin is deeply knowledgeable about Imperial Russia, and Georgian nationalism and Polish nationalism make a huge impression on him, right? He wants to fold Georgia into a federation to tamp down Georgian nationalism. And he has an argument with Lenin about this, a famous argument, not over the principle, but over the tactics of how he's doing that. He's against the Polish-Soviet war because he doesn't think that the Poles are going to rise up. The Polish working class is going to rise up in 1920 against Polish rule. As bourgeois rule, they're going to consolidate behind it as ethnic nationalists, right? So Stalin has a deeper than tactical sense of the nation question. And it's in part because of the facts on the ground. Putting the genie back in the bottle is a difficult proposition by 1921, but it's also because of firsthand experience. Now, if you extrapolate farther into time, you're going to see this undercurrent, this inheritance from the Tsarist regime of denial of the Ukrainian nation, right? But it's not going to be very effective precisely because of all the work that Stalin's doing on a realist and tactical basis to promote nationalism, even as he's murdering nationalists, right? You just cannot go back very easily to the Tsarist era view. In addition, you have proponents of the ethnic nations from within them who are very articulate, right? You have Lukashenko, for example, the Ukrainian dissident, who spends 27 years in prison by accurately quoting Lenin on the Ukrainian nation. Accurately quoting Lenin, he gets 27 years, right, in a gulag for this. Unbelievably courageous and brave and actually correct on the facts. So when you have advocates like that, in addition to what the regime is doing, it would be a mistake to credit the regime alone on this. You have this guy, Krastyo Stanchev, who's known to history as Christian Rakovsky, who's born in Bulgaria, grows up in Romania, and is educated in France. And he is the principal advocate for non-absorption of Ukraine into Russia in 1922-23. And he gives Stalin fits. He's not an ethnic Ukrainian, but he's the head of the government in Ukraine. He's an ethnic Bulgarian who's been Romanianized and Frenchified, right? He'll eventually side with Trotsky, and he'll have all sorts of problems with Stalin. He'll be shot in one of the trials. But Rakovsky, very courageously, along with Mykola Skripnik and various other ethnic Ukrainians, is a strong lobby internal to the regime about the importance, the existence of the Ukrainian nation. That combination from inside with Stalin's machinations, it makes it very difficult to take the old Tsarist line on this question. And Putin is not going to be able to put that genie back in the bottle. That was the principal upshot of today's lecture. As much as he might like to imagine that the Catherine the Great world still exists, and there's ambiguity on whether Ukraine is a nation, that's a falsehood. That's impossible to overcome the facts on the ground today, even though he's causing tremendous grief, as we know. The first part of the question?
It was just a supplement to what you said and agreed with about,
Okay.
about Russians' interest in border revision and at the end of the...
Okay, yeah, so great powers revise territorial settlements when they can. That's an empirical statement. And it's not as shocking as we've made it out to be. This is not a validation of those actions. I've taken no position whatsoever on who's right and wrong in this conflict. I have positions, but this is about the historical stuff, so I've tried to avoid taking the positions that I might express later in our discussion if there's opportunity. But great powers do revise territorial settlements. One of the reasons, I argue this in the book at length, one of the reasons the Versailles Treaty failed. Why did Versailles fail, right? The narrative of Versailles' failure is that there was a lack of will to enforce it. The British and the French imposed a too harsh treaty and then lacked the will to enforce it. So it was a blunder and a lack of will, right? That's wrong. That's not why the Versailles Treaty failed. The Versailles Treaty failed because it was the one time since 1870 that both German power and Russian power were flat on their backs. That was an anomaly. You are not going to get a situation where Germany was destroyed and Russia was destroyed at the same time and stayed that way. One of them, if not both, were going to come back as a great power. And in the event, both came back. And both were not party to the settlement. The settlement was imposed on Germany and done without the Soviet Union. And when they had the power to revise that treaty, they did so. And that was the failure of Versailles. It was an anomalous moment in history misperceived. The idea of imposing a treaty on both Germany and Russia in 1919 was the mistake. Not the harshness of the terms. The Germans might well have imposed a harsher treaty had they won the war, right? Not the lack of will to enforce it, but the inability to enforce it even if the will had been there, right? And so I'm not comparing the Putin regime to what happened after Versailles. I'm just suggesting that we have to be careful on the territorial revision question to have a historical perspective also on that, which doesn't validate but may end up illuminating the question.
Other questions? One over there.
Hello, Mitchum in Third Class Meadows. I know we have prefaced on this a few times as far as Stalin encouraging a national Ukraine, but I'm just struggling with understanding how was it in Stalin's best interest to support national independency, because wouldn't that cause, just nationalism cause nations to pull away from his desire for the RSFSA?
Yes, so it did. You're right. It was a big problem for him. But remember, he had the Communist Party. And the Communist Party had something called party discipline. And if you were a member of the party, you had to submit to party discipline. If you wanted to rise up anywhere in a position of authority, you had to join the party. So you have the promotion of ethnic nationalism for tactical reasons, and also because you can't overcome it, but you have other mechanisms that blunt the power of nationalism, including Communist Party membership. Now remember, the Soviet Union is a federation. The state is a federation, but the party is not a real federation. The Ukrainian Central Committee, the Central Committee of the Ukrainian Communist Party, it has the same rights and responsibilities as a Russian province party committee. So if you're in Vladimir province or Voronezh province or any province in Russia, you have the same amount of power inside the Communist Party as the leaders of the Ukrainian Communist Party in Ukraine have, according to the party statutes. So Stalin has mechanisms to tamp down the nationalism, to obtain the loyalty. He's got countervailing tendencies, countervailing mechanisms at his disposal. But nonetheless, it's a difficult problem to manage, the containment and the encouragement of nationalism at the same time. But this is the thing. The state keeps getting bigger. The Soviet state keeps growing. And remember, there's no private economy. So the entire economy is run by the state. It's owned and managed by the state. So you have a nearly unlimited expansion of state officials. And that expansion of state officials is done not 100%, but strongly on the basis of the titular nation, the nationality of that particular republic. So to run Ukraine, Stalin is promoting not exclusively, but in large measure, ethnic Ukrainians. Now, there are pressures to Russify. The more you Russify, the higher your career can go in the Soviet Union, for example. Ukraine can be not the end of your career, but you can get promoted to the central elite. So like any large state, there are strong tendencies of taking over the national language, the national culture as your own, right? But inside Ukraine, there are also strong tendencies which Stalin is backing on purpose to Ukrainianize Ukraine without the intention that they would go apart. Sometimes it's very arbitrary when he comes down against people. They think they're loyal. He thinks they're disloyal in practicing their Ukrainianization, right? It's a very complicated and, in fact, ugly picture in the details. But the larger question is indisputable, that because of the expansion of state positions and the need to fill them, and the use of Ukrainian nation in Ukraine, like Kazakh nation in Kazakhstan, right? Like eventually Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, right? There's no question that he's using this nationalism as a lever, right, to rule these places, to win the allegiance of the elites, and to keep their allegiance, even though it's a tightrope that he walks.
There was another question over there?
I think we go way back.
Oh, way back. Oh, yeah, okay.
Hi, Steve.
All right.
I'm Michael David Fox, here for the History Department at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. I'm very taken with your argument that sort of nationally and territorially, the most germane period is the early Soviet and Stalinist nationalities policy. But my question would be about the ideological, if you want to put it that way, roots of the current crisis, where on Russian TV, fascist Nazi junta is repeated, and it seems to gain a lot of support in Russia. And I wonder if this also is not a product of the war and the post-war Stalin period. And so my question really is about the relevance of World War II for the current events, because for many reasons, the German occupation and in the RSFSR was not highlighted after the war, and the ethnic Russian collaborators were not highlighted, and so collaboration with the Germans became associated with the non-Russians and especially Ukrainians.
Yes, thank you for that. I entirely agree with everything you just stated. I could potentially amplify it. What we know about the World War II experience that's important is that Ukrainian integral nationalism, right? Integral nationalism is the hard nationalism. It's not just Princeton is great. It's Yale sucks, right? Those are the T-shirts that the kids walk around on campus with. That's integral nationalism. It could be Princeton is great and Yale is great. That's not integral nationalism. To be great, the other person has to be subhuman, right? That's integral nationalism. The integral nationalism movement on Ukrainian territory during World War II is a failure for the most part. In fact, the German occupation is deeply hated. The integral nationalist, Ukrainian nationalist movement is incapable of defeating the Soviet allegiance during World War II. This is the principal upshot of Amir Weiner's work, but it's in other work as well. This doesn't mean that they don't make inroads. They do. It doesn't mean they have no constituency. They have a constituency, but it is not the predominant movement. A different kind of nationalism, Soviet Ukraine, is stronger than the Ukrainian integral nationalism, the anti-Semitic integral nationalism, right? But the integral nationalist episode is now blown up out of proportion in the contemporary Russian scene to paint Ukrainians as collaborators with Hitler en masse and as descendants of fascism or today's fascists, right? This is a very tendentious narrative, obviously, rooted in partial facts, but the bigger story of World War II is the failure of Germany to have an occupation regime that wins Ukrainian allegiance, and the failure of an Ukrainian national alternative to get majority support because of its excessively hard-edged nature.
Okay, I think the final question.
Hi, Keith Darden, American University. I want to push you a bit. Far be it from me to deny the powerful effect of Soviet communism or Stalinism, but you're presenting as though all that existed before was essentially erased or molded again into a cohesive Soviet Ukrainianism. But we see a lot of divisions in Ukraine in the contemporary period that look very pre-Soviet in their origins. In other words, the differences between the South and East, what Putin is calling Novorossiya, and the West are very real differences in contemporary Ukrainian politics. And so I'm wondering whether the Stalinist treatment took more effectively in some parts of Ukraine rather than others, and whether there's anything that you uncovered in the archival research that you've done that suggests that the Soviets were aware that they were dealing with very different and more pro-Russian populations in the south and east of Ukraine than they were dealing with in the center and the west.
Okay. So I took no position on the depth of Ukrainian national feeling as it existed in 1917, 18, 19, 20, 21. I said there were debates about this, and certain people felt that there was a strong Ukrainian national sentiment already in existence, and others didn't think so. But I took no position on that particular question. We could have that argument if you want, but I think we're kind of out of time. We would have to do that offline. But on your point about whether there are long-term trends, as it were, inside or underneath the Sovietization, this is a very important question, and I can't give it the subtle answer that it requires, and in fact, you've written subtly on this question yourself. So here we have Eugene Weber, Peasants into Frenchmen, and it is, unfortunately, a very widespread model now. It's not peasants into Frenchmen. It's peasants into Republicans with a small r. The political content of the nation is more important than the paint-by-the-numbers creation of nations. And so it's Soviet Ukraine. It's not just peasants into Ukrainians. It's peasants into Soviet Ukrainians, and there's a political culture there, and there are political practices there, right? This doesn't mean that the Soviet is 100% of Soviet Ukraine, but the Soviet part is the predominant content of the Ukrainian nation in all parts of Ukraine. And to repeat, West Ukrainian bastion, Lviv, Lvov, Lemberg, is a Soviet-era phenomenon. Now, you can argue that it was antithetical to Soviet interests. You can argue that the Soviets made a mistake. You can argue that the Soviets didn't do that on purpose, right? Create a bastion of West Ukrainian national identity inside the territory of the Soviet Union. But there is no deep, widespread, implanted West Ukrainian national identity in that city before the Soviet period, before Stalin. It's a very important thing. And therefore, what to others look like West Ukrainian nationalism, to me, looks like Soviet Ukrainianism in a slightly different form from the other part of Ukraine. Now remember, many of the West Ukrainian city livers, urbanites, after Stalin in the pact annexes eastern Poland and makes it West Ukraine, many of those people who move to that city are not solely from the countryside, the Ukrainian-speaking countryside of former Galicia. Many of them are from eastern Ukraine. So here we have a very interesting phenomenon where eastern Ukrainian imports become the stuff of this Western Ukrainian identity, right? So that's a question beyond Soviet intentions in many ways, but also has to be put in, the Sovietism has to be put in there, right? Michael David Fox asked about the extent to which this World War II narrative is also an important artifact for understanding today's situation, and I agreed with that, right? But I'm adding to that the fact that what we regard as primordial or pre-Soviet West Ukrainian national identity needs to be revised as at least partially and maybe even predominantly a Soviet artifact also, even if it's different in some ways from Eastern Ukraine.
Well, we could go on for a very long time. You've made some very provocative and interesting statements. I hope you will all go out and read the book. Please join me in thanking Professor Kotkin for a wonderful lecture.